When it comes to navigating the path of the artistic journey, there's a certain practice you can integrate into your art that I find is either overlooked or under-discussed. And it's that of crafting, inhabiting, and becoming utterly absorbed in your own imaginative space that's based on whatever may be significant to you. Everyone is already well aware of and places high importance on the value of honing your skills in art. But amongst most artists, the idea of honing your aesthetic and learning to relish in it seems to be viewed with lesser importance or as an afterthought to be considered later down the road, after the skills have already been honed. Yet, this is a concept that I strongly believe should be taken into account today. And to explain what I mean by aesthetic, in addition to the dictionary definition, I also mean that you, as an artist, should prioritize knowing very well your tastes, your opinions, your beliefs, your habits, and your tendencies and inclinations. The awareness of the interconnectedness of all of these components is your aesthetic. Giving careful attention to these components of your preferences and developing this awareness is the key to knowing what exactly you want to say with your art and the direction you want to take it in. I also want to note that the topic of aesthetics, as I'm framing it, isn't merely a matter of art style as it's typically discussed, because I don't think the term art style quite captures the breadth of possibilities and applications that our aesthetic preferences have in life and how we interface with and filter our experience through them consciously and unconsciously. Even though I'm discussing aesthetics within the context of your art, to hone your aesthetic doesn't only apply to the surface level look of your art. It really encompasses a much broader scope of personal perspectives and ideals, and it factors in your opinions on everything, including but not limited to your art. But in addition to taking formation by drawing from all of these sources in your life, your aesthetic is also applicable to everything else in your life, which also happens to include your art. But so much of this has to do with your opinions. So I'd like to ask you, what are your opinions? At first, this might seem like something you wouldn't need to think about much to answer, but upon further inspection, it's entirely likely that you've gone your entire art practice without confronting and clarifying your opinions to yourself. And these clarified opinions are what you need to have to be able to answer any questions about your art. Every great artist who has seemed to have honed their own aesthetic only did so by forging strong opinions and beliefs that are the underpinnings of their aesthetic decisions. And I say forge to highlight the intentional nature of this act, because you can't just have any sort of opinion or belief pop up unquestioned and expect that to be enough to guide you in your art. You need to craft your opinions about the things you interact with in your life and vet them carefully. And this is an important part of the art. I think that maybe these opinions happen to arise without an incredibly concentrated and deliberate effort more often in the past than now, since today, in addition to having more immediate access to the opinions of others than ever before, we live in an age where we're generally not asked to have strong convictions about our personal tastes, and instead we're expected to conform to the tastes and aesthetics dictated by those other than ourselves. And even if the world doesn't present it as overtly as this, it is still the case that the opinions of others have already been laid before us, and more often than not, we just adopt them as if they're options for us to choose from. All of us are surrounded by everyone else's thoughts with such frequency that we often forget to harbor our own. But now I'm asking you to forego this commonplace passive acceptance of whatever your preferences are in favor of deeply elaborating upon these thoughts that may initially seem inconsequential. Take your likes and dislikes, for example. These are thoughts that you can expound upon in a self-dialogue or in the form of questioning. Interrogate yourself each time you're confronted by your preferences and aversions in art and in your day-to-day life, such as when you see a painting and you're drawn to its colors, yet later, upon seeing a similar painting with a similar use of color, you don't find it as appealing as the first one you saw. In this case, was it really the use of color in the first painting that cued you in, or was it a particular arrangement of the colors in the second one that caused you to disregard it? Or maybe not the arrangement, but the role the color served in these paintings, or the subject matter. And from this, you can ask yourself even more questions, like, which is more important to you, color or these other elements? Maybe the difference between these two paintings when distilled down to their core traits is less obvious than you first thought, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is or put it into words if someone asked you. I could go on with this example, but I think you should start this process for yourself instead. These are some of my favorite questions to ask myself and try to come up with answers to. Whenever I encounter two or more things, let's say great pieces of art, for example, that seem similar on the surface, but for some reason one of them either stands out or is less interesting to me, noticing this gap in my understanding of my own preferences, determining what subtle key elements are present or missing that appear in other things I know I like, and being able to eventually verbalize a conclusion about my opinions on this specific thing is such a valuable and insightful process to give myself the gift of pondering over. Answering such questions often involves finding the common threads between your past and current preferences, and these common threads aren't limited to the realm of art. There are cross-dimensional links to be found between your opinions in art and your opinions everywhere else in life. Simply taking the time to be curious about why you like and don't like the things you do has an interesting effect of revealing conclusions about yourself that, in hindsight, seem so obvious that you'd be surprised you hadn't made these connections earlier. But to some extent, it kind of makes sense why these things only become obvious after scrutiny. Answers or insights about ourselves lie in everything about how we interact with, well, everything. It's likely that many aspects of your tastes and preferences are things you simply know you feel, think about in passing, and maybe you've only ever occasionally put into words a hypothesis as to why you might like certain things and why you might dislike others. But formulating these thoughts is an important venture into better understanding yourself, which in turn allows you to, in a way, arrange these self-discoveries into a manner of aesthetic expression that is signature to you, uniquely yours, whether it be stylistically, thematically, or semantically. These formations are what become the basis of your opinions, which are crucial guiding forces in art. Opinions make artistic decisions more purposeful, and every single aspect of your art, upon deeper investigation, can be translated into a statement of your opinion about something. From the way you hold the pencil to the types of strokes you like to make, what subject matter you gravitate towards, why you're attracted to some things and averse to others, and so forth. The stronger the opinion and the clarity of each opinion, the more focused intent becomes possible in your art, and the more you're able to make each and every little component of your practice meaningful, personalized, and on theme. And you don't need to look far to start seeing what being on theme with your art might mean for you either. The thoughts we have and the impulses we react to things with are practically screaming at us what our opinions are. A sort of imaginary guidebook of themes and aesthetics with your name on it is already written, page by page, directly into the fabric of your being. It's just up to you to translate or interpret this book from its cryptic source language of unconscious biases and gut feelings into something you could actually utilize to your advantage. And of course, you might not be able to put into words every bit of detail behind these opinions and how they appear in your art, but regularly questioning the tendencies that would otherwise run subconsciously sets into motion the likelihood of further investigations in the future, and it makes habitual what I find to be one of the most important components of creativity, which is curiosity. Please, be curious about these things. Don't take them for being small or insignificant. You can always rewrite or clarify these thoughts even further if you need to, and that's par for the course when it comes to self-discovery. In the end, it's your capacity to exercise curiosity that truly frees you. But despite its importance, this act of questioning your opinions is probably not enough on its own to make much headway in discovering and operating under your aesthetic. Asking questions is really at the core of all of these insights. But honing your aesthetic also requires you to both regularly put yourself in situations that prompt these questions to begin with, and to give yourself the space to investigate and draw conclusions about your findings, both literally and figuratively. The common advice that would allow us to be put into situations that prompt self-questioning is similar to what I'd suggest myself, which would be to consume the art of others and allow yourself to be influenced and inspired. And while I think this advice can sometimes give a helpful dose of motivation or direction, I don't think it's specific enough when it's just presented like this. Looking at the art of others isn't often framed as grounds for self-questioning, and yet I think it's more helpful when approached this way rather than as an intentional quest for inspiration. because searching solely for inspiration will more than likely cut off the wide gamut of possible questions to ask about yourself by narrowing your focus down only to the things you might like. And as we've already discussed, engaging with what you like is just one part of honing your aesthetic. Of course, looking at the art of others is certainly entertaining, and it can have the occasional side effect of inspiration. But it's important to realize that consuming rapidly is for prompting questions and not for getting answers. You need to regularly go through periods where you're no longer searching outside yourself for aesthetic conclusions and inspirations, and instead begin an internal search in isolation through your art. It's a delicate cycle, and only consuming rapidly without honoring your generative urge habituates consumption without output. And the reason this consumptive trap won't help much in finding answers to your aesthetic concerns is because any answer is not what someone else is doing. When it comes to honing your aesthetic, it's likely not something being done in the world that you can point to assuredly and say, that's exactly it. Other people can't hand it off to you or tell you what it should be, either directly or indirectly, even amongst the most well-intentioned artists and teachers. You can't search outside yourself and be surrounded by the thoughts of others and expect conclusions to what needs to be found within yourself to emerge. And to be clear, when I say thoughts in this context, I mean both linguistic thoughts like what people say and visual thoughts like their art. Only you can craft this realm for yourself, and you do so through the refinement of your thoughts. So upon having unresolved questions, give yourself the time to retreat and process everything in solitude. You can always process these new thoughts and questions through pondering and through words, or you can process them visually through your art, all in an attempt to arrive at some sort of conclusion. And from this view, every conclusion you arrive upon is your art. It's the refined expression of your ideas and the things you've contemplated with, almost like in the form of a report of these findings. And the most captivating thing about this to me is that it doesn't just end after each piece. As we continue to contemplate these things, we only refine our thoughts on them further, and by extension, we refine our art in what becomes this ongoing cyclical chain of dismantling our core suppositions and, piece by piece, discovery after discovery, taking great strides towards eventually reconstituting them beautifully into a visual artifact of the whole endeavor. You're the only one in the world that has your exact combination of preferences and experiences. So, in knowing this, your aesthetic isn't really something you search for, but is rather a collection of habits and procedures forged by interests and curiosities that are already uniquely yours. And in the long run, it's an inevitability of allowing yourself to be you. So, as such, the only thing left to do is to begin the process of normalizing this allowance. Be the tastemaker of your own world. Sit down and figure out what's appealing to you and what doesn't represent you, and get personal, because everything in art should be to taste, to your taste, that is. An argument for honing your aesthetic is an argument for knowing yourself and not being confused about what your opinions are and why. And again, don't just have opinions. Craft incredibly nuanced opinions. Give your art thought. It deserves it. Thanks for listening.